Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, chapter 2, Halacha 1. This is part 2 of the Shir. We were getting into this back and forth in part 1, very important back and forth, between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya. And this, by the way, comes up in the Yerushalmi as a dispute between Rava and Abaya. And the ultimate, in the dispute, when you look at the Rambam, he says in his commentary in the Mishnah that actually both Rava and Abaya are correct. They're just talking about different nuances of the law. We have a similar situation over here, I believe. I believe that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Hoshaya are actually rehashing the same argument that's occurring in Masechet Shabbos about the status of the Jews tithing at the time here. One opinion is going to be, that's going to be the opinion of Rabbi Hoshaya, that the Jews have so much respect for the different tithes and the holy that the majority are going to be taking out the tithes. And so then you have to take out Demai on behalf of why the minority is not taking out the tithes. That's the opinion of Rabbi Hoshaya. In other words, he's saying that most of the people are respecting the Kedusha of Trumos and Meiser Rishon and Trumos Meiseros, and they're separating those tithes out because they have respect for it. And this then is getting into a case of what happens if you're purchasing produce from a non-Jew. Are you going to have to separate out tithes? Are you going to be assuming, in this case that we were just talking about, like we have a merchant caravan and they're holding goods that probably came from a non-Jewish farmer, then the question is, is this going to be treated like definite tevel, or is it going to be treated like demai? Rabbi Yochanan's opinion is going to be where the Jews are mostly just separating out Trumos and Maestros. I'm sorry, the Truma Gedola tithe. And the majority is separating out that tithe, but not the others. And because of that, you have to separate out tithes because it can be assumed, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that the other sets of tithes were not taken. That's the basis of this dispute. This, by the way, in the rest of chapter 2, Halacha 1, is going to be getting into the borders of Eretz Yisrael, and it's also going to be getting into the laws of Shvius, because we have similar kinds of laws in Shvius and also Maestros. For instance, if you're growing produce on land that is not from the Ole Bavel territory, you don't need to worry about taking out Trumos and Maestros. And if you don't need to worry about taking out Trumos and Maestros, you don't need to worry about taking out Demai. So you're going to be getting into some of the subtleties in the rest of chapter 2 also about what happens if you're importing produce from outside the land or you're from somewhere else, and you could be dealing with other laws of Shvius like Sfichin. Sfichin is going to be the aftergrowth that could have grown in the 7th year. And then, the question is this going to be, if you are in an area that's exporting produce from out of Eretz Yisrael into a area just past the boundary, do you have to start worrying about Sfichin and also Demai? So that's what we're going to be getting into the rest of chapter 2. We're going to continue with this back and forth between this very important point about Rabbi Hoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan. Again, the Rambam ultimately says that both of them are right, and they're right for different reasons, and they have different nuances in the law which make them right. So don't just blow them off. So Rabbi Chia Bar Ada asks in front of Rabbi Mana, and he's saying, why does Rabbi Nehemiah rule that produce purchased from a merchant who utilizes different suppliers is always Demai? This, by the way, is where we left off in the first part of the Shir. And over there in the first part of the Shir, the Brisa says that Rabbi Nehemiah says if somebody purchases from a merchant, and that merchant has a variety of suppliers. He's getting from the non-Jew, from the Jew, who's a chaver, an Ama Aretz, a Kuthian, and it's known that at different times he actually is purchasing from different suppliers, then his produce is going to be Demai. It's not definite tevel. So that's also a thing of suffix too, because sometimes the Kuthians were observing, sometimes not. It depends on the time, depends on where the Kuthians are treated in the term of Rabban Gamliel, who declared them to be not Jewish, but sometimes they were considered to be Jewish. So also, if you know for sure this supplier, this merchant's only getting from non-Jews, then you have to treat it as definite tevel. If you're getting it from where he knows that it's coming from a chaver, then you can assume that the produce has been had the tithes taken out properly. Now, if it's going to be a mix, and he's saying, well, sometimes I get from a Jew, sometimes I get from a non-Jew, sometimes I get from an Am Haaretz, then the idea is that you're going to treat it like Demai. It's not going to be definite tevel, because sometimes the Am Haaretz is going to tithe it. Sometimes the Kuthian, if they're going to be Jews at that time, are going to tithe it. Sometimes certainly always the chaver is going to tithe it. You don't know which pile of grain this came from. So Rabbi Chia Bar Ada asks in front of Rabbi Mana, and he asks a question: why does Rabbi Nehemiah rule that produce purchased from a merchant who utilizes different suppliers is always Demai? And the Gemara says, from whom did this merchant, purchase this particular batch of produce according to his own statement? And the Gemara says, let us say, in other words, let the law be, that if he purchases from a Jew, it is Demai, and if he says he purchased it from a non-Jew, it's always definite tevel. And basically, the Vilna Goan is pointing out, why is it that Rabbi Nehemiah is in fact ruling that the produce of Demai, that this is going to be the produce of Demai, regardless of the merchant's claim to the contrary. And that's going to be interesting. In other words, we might believe that the merchant, if he says that he got the produce from a non-Jewish farmer, we treat it as definite tevel. And the insight here is, the Gemara is wondering, why do we ignore the merchant's claim that he obtained the produce from a non-Jew? And that would actually end up where you had a more stringent ruling on the tevel. In other words, if you asked the merchant, and he said, I got it from a non-Jew, why don't you just treat it like definite tevel and just take it out? It's more strict. Why is it that you would treat it like Demai? And this is, again, you're doing business with a merchant who's ending up with Jewish supplier, non-Jewish suppliers, and maybe he's wrong about where he got this particular batch of grain from. That's, I think, what the halacha is pointing to. In other words, it's just like you're not relying on the Am Haaretz to testify on the status of the grain as tithed. Effectively, the merchant would effectively be making a testimony, and the merchant might be an Am Haaretz. The merchants effectively would be making a testimony if you were to go with this strict ruling. In other words, if you were to assume that, the merchant claims that this particular piece of grain, normally I get, grain from a range of suppliers, and you ask him, well, what about this particular pile? Where did you get this particular pile? And he testifies and he says, I got it from the non-Jewish one. And they say, it's definite tevel. I have to separate out tithes from that. Very serious, right? Well, Rabbi Nehemiah is saying, no, it's Demai. And why would that be? Well, we know that in Jewish law, if an Am Haaretz is testifying about the status of the tithes, he's not to be believed. And so if he's saying, I had all the tithes taken out, you don't trust him on it. Also, similar laws is if the produce became wet. And then what happens is he testifies and says, it became wet, which makes it subject to the laws of Tuma, right? But he says, but it didn't come in contact with anything that's Temeh. He's not allowed to be trusted on it because he doesn't know enough about the laws in order to make that statement. He's not a Haver, he's not a Torah scholar. And so effectively, if you were to rule strictly on this, you'd effectively be putting the merchant into a similar kind of category where he's actually testifying on the status of this. And, what if he made a mistake? So they're going to be ruling that this is going to be lenient and it's going to be treated as Demai. Why? Well, you could say that, actually, if you look at all of his grain together, not just this particular pile, basically, a lot of it came from a Jew. A lot of it came from a non-Jew. And so, if you were looking at it together, you could say that, well, perhaps, collectively that, you could assume, which one is it? Is it, you would say like, this one had tithes, this one didn't have tithes, and then you would just say, well, I'm assuming that, I'm buying the one that did have tithes, so I'm separating it out as Demai. And so the testimony of the merchant is not going to be valid enough to override that. In other words, there's not really two witnesses, it's just one witness, and that anyway in Jewish law is not a hazakah. It's not enough to testify on the validity of something like this. And I think that that's why you would end up with this lenient ruling on it and just say, well, it's going to be treated as Demai instead of definite tevel. The Gemara is going to answer the question by supporting Rabbi Yochanan's view about this. He's going to answer this question, and it's going to be answered by Rabbi Yochanan's view. So the Gemara says, interpret the Bryce as referring to a case where the merchant is a non-Jew and a non-Jew are passing before him. And they're saying, why is this merchant not trusted when he identifies the seller of, the particular item of produce? He's saying this particular pile of grain is from this and this supplier. That's what it's asking. So, the purchaser, is going to end up treating it like Demai. And the Gemara says it's considered Demai. So the Bryce is going to basically be hinting at Rabbi Yochanan's position that produce purchased from a non-Jew whose grower is unknown is only going to be Demai. And that's a big Kiddush. In other words, Mara Fulda is saying that this Bryce is ruling that produce purchased from a non-Jew whose grower is unknown is Demai because most of Eretz Yisrael at this time is going to be owned by Jews, and we're going to follow the law of the majority. And so he's saying that, at this time in this area, it's likely that it came from a Jewish farmer. Now, if we have a neighborhood, and we know this from other laws, so if you have a neighborhood and you have a butcher there and you have, 10 butchers, and there's a piece of meat in a bag and it's unmarked, and 4 of the butchers are non-kosher, 6 are kosher. You assume that in this area that the meat is going to be kosher because the majority of the butchers there are going to be kosher. And so, for the same logic, if you have the majority of the farmers at the time in Eretz Yisrael being Jewish, then it's likely that yes, even if this particular pile of grain came from a non-Jewish farmer, one, you're not taking the testimony of the merchant. He's not going to be regarded as a reliable enough testimony by himself, and on this particular pile of grain, because the piles of grain all look the same, right? And so then you're going to consider it Demai also because the farmers, the majority of the farmers are going to be Jewish. If the majority of the farmers were going to be non-Jewish, then you would consider it to be definite tevel. Now, this is going to challenge this opinion. Rabbi Hoshaya is going to ask and says, but a Mishnah supports Rabbi Yochanan. And in other words, he's saying that this is going to pose a difficulty for Rabbi Lazar. And, Rabbi Hoshaya is going to be challenging the Gemara, and, basically is basically, there's a question like, well, why is Rabbi Hoshaya now pointing out a Mishnah that can support Rabbi Yochanan's view? And the Gemara says that it was taught in a Mishnah. Rabbi Yudah said the pomegranates of Baden, the leeks of Geva, were not mentioned with regards to other laws. Rather, they were mentioned with regard to the law that they should be tithed as definite tevel and not merely as Demai in any place, even outside of the land of Israel. So the pomegranates or Baden are very, very big. It's a place. Geva is also a place, and these are going to be very, very high quality produce. And there's a tradition in the sages that the pomegranates of Baden are larger and better quality than everywhere else in Eretz Yisrael. And the same would be with regards to the leeks here, although I don't know anything about these leeks, but I know that they're regarded as very, very high quality and visually distinctive. Anyway, so what's happening here is, generally speaking, produce from an Amma Aretz is going to be tithed as Demai. Now, it's pointing out these specialty produce within Eretz Yisrael. And the pomegranates of Baden, the leeks of Geva, that if you buy them from Amma Aretz, it has to be treated as definite tevel. And why would that be? And the Marafulda explains because Baden and Geva are populated by Kuthians, and they're only tithing produce that they themselves eat, but not the produce that they sell to others. And that is going to be the problem with the Kuthians. Kuthians, by the way, were a non-Jewish group that the Assyrian emperor brought down from Kutha to Eretz Yisrael to replace the 10 tribes. And they had this policy, the Assyrians had a policy where they would mix up the people in the empire so the people wouldn't get particularly attached. So presumably they conquered Kutha, and then they took these people and they moved them down here. And then at some point they had a conversion, and the Gemara is going to always be wondering, was the conversion valid or not? And so Kuthians, if at that time that they're going to be considered Jewish, the produce is going to be subject to the Maestro laws. And this prohibition is going to be pointing out that at this particular point of time, they were tithing their own product, but not other people's product. And the Vilna Goan is going to be saying about this that the pomegranates of Baden and the leeks of Geva look different than other pomegranates and leek, and they're therefore recognizable from Baden and Geva, so you have to tie them as definite tevel, regardless of where they're purchased. Also, the Baden pomegranates are going to have different laws with regards to when things fall into mixtures. So they're always going to be visually distinctive. And so when this is going to fall into a pile of pomegranates, and if the Baden pomegranate is going to be Demai, even if you have it falling into 105 pomegranates, it's still not going to be nullified. Normally, it'll be nullified at 101. In other words, you have the 101st unit. The first unit of the 101st unit is going to be the Demai one, right? And it falls into 100 Tahor ones. It gets nullified. But if you have a Baden pomegranate, it's so visually distinctive that it's not going to be nullified in that, because you would say, oh, it's that one. That one's the Baden one. It's not like a normal one. So Rabbi Hoshaya is going to analyze the ruling that these pomegranates and leeks are treated as definite tevel. And the Gemara says, with what case are we dealing with? Who's the seller? And he says, if the case is the one where the person purchasing it is going to be from a Jew, in that case, we would teach in the Mishnah that we must treat these varieties definite tevel, and we don't. So, because produce that's purchased from a Jewish Amma Aretz, it should be tied like Demai. That's the Masechet Demai. So, if you're purchasing produce from an Amma Aretz and you're Jewish, you separate out Demai. That's the point. You don't treat it like definite tevel. So, what case are we dealing with here? And Rabbi Hoshaya is pointing out, he says, rather, we're dealing with a case where someone's purchasing the produce from a non-Jew, and that's why it's treated as definite tevel. So Rabbi Hoshaya is making an inference from this analysis and is, ending up to make a challenge. And in other words, he's saying that, already we know that if you're buying the produce from a Jew, that you're going to separate out Demai. That's the point of what we're talking about. That's the rabbinic ruling. So what case could we possibly be talking about with regards to the Baden pomegranates? Why would you be treating it as tevel? You'd be treating it as tevel because you purchased it from a non-Jew. And as the Marafulda points out, this at the time was grown in Baden and And this other place, Geva, was located where the Kuthians lived. And again, you always have a back and forth. Were the Kuthians Jewish? Were they not Jewish? And so at the time, the practice of the Kuthians was such where the Kuthians would only tithe the produce that they had. They wouldn't tithe the produce at all when they were selling it. So you would treat it as definite tevel. That's what they're saying. In other words, Rabbi Hoshai is also pointing out that he's of the opinion that the Kuthians at this time are not Jewish. Even though they're doing some of the Jewish practice, it's still not Jewish. They also, by the way, the Kuthians had an idol at the top of their mountain. So certainly at the time that the majority of the Kuthians are worshiping this idol, they're not going to be considered to be converts or Jews. So the Gemara is going to deflect the challenge, and Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yitzhak says that we are dealing with the position that all species purchased from non-Jewish merchants are treated as definite tevel, and that, by the way, is Rabbi Lazar's position that we saw earlier. And the Mishnah is implying that most species are only treated as Demai, and we're dealing with a case where somebody purchased from a Jew, as Rabbi Hoshai's position is, of why the Jewish, if the seller is Jewish, that these pomegranates and leeks are treated as definite tevel. And the Mishnah is actually referring to a case where, if you had a powerful government official there present, again, there was Roman persecution, who would pressure the merchant to sell at very, very low prices, then in that case, the rabbis permitted the merchant to sell produce that's tevel without tithing it. Why? Because if they're taking out tithes and the government is in the shuk and they're trying to force cheap food sales and not take out tithes, well then what's happening is, if you're taking out tithes, you're causing the food prices to change around a little bit, right? So if you had a case where you had Roman persecution, and if you had a case where a Jew were selling this, and you had what condition could this be? This could be where you have non-Jewish conqueror basically forcing Jews to not do the laws of tevel or to not follow the laws of tithing, and to basically be selling food that is going to be tevel. And so then what happens is you have a case where at a situation and a situation where people could be Jewish and selling this produce and end up having it where it's definite tevel. So that's what the Mishnah is trying to point out, and the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that the rabbis decreed that the purchaser must be concerned for himself in the case and tithe the produce as definite tevel. So the Mara Fulda is saying that the reason that one generally does not have to treat produce bought from a Jewish merchant as definite tevel is because the merchant has to tithe the produce before he sells it. Okay, but the case here is going to be where perhaps you have a government official and he's pressuring the merchants to sell at low prices, and then the rabbis at this time are going to suspend the obligation to ease the burden on the merchants and to do that. And so basically they're going to be saying that, yeah, you can go buy this produce, no problem, but just make sure that you're treating it as definite tevel and make sure you're separating out the tithes. So again, they were the ones who set up the laws of Demai and the system of Demai, and they're also the ones who are able to repeal it. And effectively what they're saying is, at this time where you have the Jewish the conquest of the Jews here, and they're pressuring the Jews to sell at low prices, just don't treat it like Demai, treat it like definite tevel, because the merchants are going to be pressured to not do tithes, just to sell everything at a low price and to not do that. So the Gemara is going to clarify the Brisa, and Rabbi Yonah presented the following ruling for discussion, and he says that if somebody brought 3 loads of produce to market at one time, this person is not presumed to be a merchant. Only if he brought them one after the other in 3 trips is he assumed to be a merchant. So we know that from Masechet Shvias that if somebody comes and comes once in a while, brings a load and sells a little bit, he's not considered to be doing business. It's not a business, it's not a regular business, and he's not considered a Shvias merchant. He's allowed to do that. However, if you have somebody who's coming to the same place, bringing regular trips, over in Shvias, he's going to be considered to be a merchant doing business, which is a problem with Shvias produce. And over here, they're basically saying that if somebody's bringing 3 times, he's bringing the produce to the market one time after the other and does it 3 times, he's going to be considered to be a merchant. Why? Because he's going to be a regular there. He's going to be doing it in a consistent fashion, and it's enough to establish him as a merchant. It creates a hazakah. So the Gemara is going to analyze the law that if a person brings 3 loads of produce to market, that he is presumed to be a merchant. And Rabbi Yonah asks and says, when someone brings 3 loads to market, he is treated as a merchant retroactively. In other words, that what this is trying to say is, what about the time of when you brought your first load? We know that after you bring your 3 loads, you've created a hazakah, you're a merchant. You, by the way, have, for establishing a hazakah 3 times in other Torah laws as well. But what about the first time? Are you going to be considered a merchant from the first load, even after the 3rd load has arrived? And they're saying, yes, retroactively, you are considered a merchant from the first load that you brought. Or actually, it's asking, are you going to be from the first load or are you not? Are you going to be, do you get this hazakah after you brought the 3rd load, or after you bring the 3rd load, are you considered like a merchant retroactively from the first load that you brought? The Gemara is going to clarify why this is important, and it asks what practical difference is there between these 2 possibilities. And the difference is in a case where somebody came and fixed and rectified tithe produce that he sold, and after he's deemed to be a merchant from the 3rd load onward. So so let's say he separated produce from the first load, and that's going to be his meiser, and then he's going to say that I'm taking the meiser on the first load from the 3rd load, or he separated produce from the 3rd load for the first load. And you're sometimes allowed to do this. So let's say I have a load over here and a load over there, and I know I'm going to bring 3 consecutive loads, and I want to separate out my meiser. So I know that all the grain is the same. I know the location that it's in, and I'm going to say, okay, the grain in my load here, I'm taking out as meiser, and I'm taking out enough to also satisfy from the 2nd load that I have in the warehouse all the way down the street that's not in front of me and that I can't see it, and that's over there. That's what this is asking. And basically, this is going to be an unresolved question. And the Gemara asks, it says, if you will say that he's treated as a merchant from now on, then you can't tithe using one batch for the other batch, because one is definite tevel and the others are going to be Demai. But if he did tithe from one batch to the other, then the tithe does not take effect, and the produce is going to be either Demai or tevel. But if the seller's treated as a merchant retroactively, then you can take out the tithes one on behalf of the other, so that you could take out the first tithes on the first load for the 3rd load, and then both of them are going to be Demai. So that's going to be a question we don't know the answer, but when Eliyahu Navi comes, we'll be able to get an answer on it. So there's another question on the 3 loads of produce. Rabbi Mana inquires and says, if the 3 loads of produce who were purchased simultaneously but by 3 people, and that's going to be that it's going to be purchased by the seller himself, his son, and his worker. The question is, are the loads legally combined to be considered 3 loads brought at one time? This, by the way, comes up as a parallel in Shvias, in the Mishnah about 5 brothers. If you have 5 brothers over there in Shvias collecting produce that's going to be wild produce, or it's going to be collected in a field, and then they're bringing it all together. Is it going to be where they're shvius merchants or not? The question is going to be over there is if they're going to be sharing the profits or not, or if it's going to be structured in a corporate way where this brother only gets the profit on this produce, and that brother only gets the profit on that produce. So if it's going to be segmented where this one only gets on the product that he brought, then it's not going to be treated as them being shvius merchants. But if they're going to be sharing the produce together, then you're going to have a shvius problem with doing business with shvius produce. In other words, it's going to be combined, and it's going to be large enough where they're going to be doing business, right? Question is going to be over here is going to be similar. If you have these 3 loads, and if one of them belongs to the son, one belongs to the worker, and one belongs to the shuk owner, the guy who owns the stall there. The question is going to combine to be where they are going to have, basically be a merchant. And, is it going to be one where they are, even retroactively, like when you brought, the third one, retroactively, would you end up being as a merchant from the first one, even though the ownership might be different? So the Gemara is going to explain this, and the Gemara is going to explain it in a way that's consistent with shvius. Rabbi Yonah wonders and says, why does Rabbi Mana ask as to the law in each of these cases? Everyone knows that the law in the following case is like this, that if a ship comes from Rome with produce, and there are many kinds of produce in the ship, you view the entire shipment as one shipment with regards to establishing, the shipper as being a merchant. Why? Because it's all shipped at the same time. And Rabbi Yonah is basically pointing out that in this case as well, if the seller, his son, and his worker, are all doing it as one shipment, they're basically going to be counted as, doing it at one time. But if it's being brought drip by drip, it's not going to be considered to be a merchant. Just like over there in Masechet Shvius, if you're just one brother out of these 5 brothers, and in this Mishnah that is talking about over there, that if the cases where only brother number 1 gets the profit out of the first shipment, out of the 5 shipments, then he is not considered to be a shvius merchant or a businessman and doing business with it. But if it combines together, then it's going to be considered like they are merchants, and that's important because then they will be shvius merchants. Now, the Mishnah is going to be talking about that. This is going to, by the way, be the Mishnah in chapter 1, Halacha 3, that Demai obligations apply only to produce in Eretz Yisrael. And the Gemara is now going to explain how to deal with produce where the origin's unknown. What do you do where you don't know where the produce came from? So the Gemara is going to say that with regards to produce that may come from Eretz Yisrael and be subject to the laws of Demai, or may come from outside of the land and be subject to, not be subject to the Jewish laws of separations. So the sages did not allow you to follow the aroma of the produce to determine the origin. In other words, you can't go smell the produce to determine where it come from. Gemara says, nor did they allow you to follow the appearance of the produce. In other words, if you're going to go and you're going to look at this wheat and say, oh, I think these wheat berries, it looks like it, I think it came from Eretz Yisrael. Well, this is not going to comply. And by the way, why, we have in the Mishnah a visual appearance. Well, the difference is going to be that in this case, the rice that's grown here is going to be perfectly white at this time. And that's going to be a siman. It's not really going to be looking at the appearance of the produce. It's really going to have a siman that's a visual marker that designates it from being here. It's not the same as trying to, stare at some wheat kernels and say, oh, I think it's from this region. The Gemara continues, says, nor from the taste, nor from the price. Rather, one must follow the place from which the majority of this kind of produce comes. So what this is trying to say is that, says the Marafulda, if the majority of the type of produce in this area comes from outside the land, it's going to be exempt from Demai. And if the majority of this exact kind of produce that you're talking about comes from within Eretz Yisrael, it's going to be obligated. So the Gemara is saying that the sages don't want you sitting there staring at it, guessing at it, smelling it, looking at the price to figure it out. They want you to use Jewish law and say, okay, where are these onions coming from? I'm just using onions as an example. If the majority is coming from outside the land and you're in a place that's outside the land, for example, then you would say that there's no worry about laws of Demai. If at this period of time you're ending up where the majority is being exported from Eretz Yisrael to this place outside the land, you would say that, I have to separate tithes. By the way, same would be working for a product that's going to be imported. Perhaps it's going to be the 8th year after Shvius, and you're going to be getting stuff coming from gardens from outside of the land, that's grown from outside of the land, that could not yet be cultivated from gardens within the land. And then at that period of time, the majority is coming from outside the land. And yes, even though at some point in the future, this same product will be coming from gardens within the land, they have not had enough time within the 8th year to prepare it and grow it. So you'd say, at this time, this is not going to be subject to tithes because it's going to be from out of the land. And so again, you're going to look at the majority of where the produce comes from. Then Gemara is going to clarify this and refine this a little bit. And the Gemara is going to say that Rabbi Yaakov Bar Acha says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that if the item in question is wine, and for example, new wine is known to come from Eretz Yisrael and aged wine is known to come from outside of the land, or vice versa, then the sages allow somebody to follow the taste in determining where it comes from. So Rabbi Kanievsky is going to explain it like this. He's going to say, since there's a great difference between the taste of new wine and aged wine, it's going to be unlikely that you would mistake one for the other. And, the idea is going to be that you'd be able to say, okay, the majority of this wine, let's just say the old wine, comes from out of the land, and you taste it and you say, it's new wine. Okay, I know it comes from in the land, I got to tithe it. Fine, there's a way to determine it, and they're going to allow that. What they don't want you doing is generally looking at it. In other words, what this sugya refinement is trying to point out is that if there's a big difference between the taste of this kind of wine, and again, wine is going to be singled out here, but again, it's going to be where you can follow the taste to determine it. They're going to allow it. Let's say it was another vegetable like carobs, or not carobs. Let's say it was bell peppers, and for some reason there's a different taste in the bell peppers, or spicy peppers. Let's say you had spicy peppers, and the peppers in Eretz Yisrael, by the way, are not very spicy at all. So let's say you have all the surrounding areas had very, very spicy peppers. And you say, I have these fresh peppers here. Let me taste it and see. And you say, the pepper's not spicy. I know it comes from in the land. I got to tithe it like Demai. Or you say, these peppers are extremely spicy. I know that Eretz Yisrael doesn't produce peppers this spicy. By the way, they've started growing habanero peppers here in Eretz Yisrael, and we get them for Shabbat. We slice them onto our hummus. Delicious, but definitely not spicy like the habaneros that grow in other places like the Caribbean or in certain parts in the South in the United States where the land has a lot of sulfur. The land here does not have a lot of sulfur, so it does not produce spicy peppers. So the Chazan Ish is going to have an explanation about this. It's also very interesting about the wine. Chazan Ish is going to say that this great difference causes new wine and aged wine to be considered completely different items, and one may therefore rely on the distinction of taste between the wines to determine whether the wine is aged or new, and thereby to determine whether or not it is from Eretz Yisrael, and it can be subject to tithes or not. Then we get to the next part of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was talking about the pressed figs that must be tithed as Demai, even from outside of the land. And I just want to remind you that the pressed figs from here were visually distinctive in that they didn't get crushed. But the ones from outside the land, even if they're very high quality, when they press them together, they would get crushed. So you have a visual distinctive marker that creates a siman. So there's an incident here. Rabbi Mana says, I went up to Caesarea. And Caesarea, by the way, is a city that was not sanctified as Eretz Yisrael. And this, by the way, is talking about Caesar Maritima, which is along the coast. This is between Tel Aviv and Haifa. And all the area that you can see there was not sanctified. We're getting up to those Mishnahs, or those halachot, later in chapter 2, halacha 1. And this also comes up in Maestros and also in Shvius. Anyway, so over there, the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say that, and I saw that they were accustomed to permit eating those pressed figs without tithing. And I asked Rabbi Yitzhak bar Eliezer, on what authority is this leniency based? And he told me that it's Zuga, that Gamliel Zuga says this, basically. So Zuga conducted himself thusly to permit it. And this is the name of a scholar who permitted the local pressed figs. And thus, the pressed figs in Caesarea, that you're allowed to eat them without tithing it. This is derived from the actions of Gamliel Zuga, but there's others who are going to be permitting this as well. The Gemara is going to try to define the boundaries of Caesarea with regards to the permit. And Rabbi Yitzchak bar Elazar says in the name of Zuga of Caesarea, in any place that you see the water, it is permitted to eat the local pressed figs without tithing. By the way, there's another Caesarea up in the Goan area called Caesar Philippi, and we're not talking about that. We are talking about any place in the vicinity where you can see the sea around Caesarea. You don't have to worry about tithes. There's an opinion that it was not taken either by the Ole Mitzrayim or the Ole Bavel. That, by the way, is going to be coming up as the opinion of Rebbe. So we're going to talk more tomorrow about the boundaries of Eretz Yisrael, because it's going to matter in terms of Shvius. We're going to get into a bit about Shvius tomorrow, and the Shemitah cycle, and then issues about what Jews and non-Jews are doing in these different parts of the land, be it inside the land or outside the land. And these are some really interesting historical contexts to be able to start putting together an understanding of tithes and what's going on for business in the land and agriculture in the land. And even if you're having a hard time getting the complexity of this, at least appreciate the historicity of it, because historically it's very interesting how all of this gets put together. So have a great day, and we're going to do it again tomorrow.